And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Tonight, guys, I'm going to be playing an interview I did on X with my good friend Anthony, who goes under the name of Market Wolf on X. I'm going to play this for you guys. It's about the nature of revolutions, dealing with the various revolutions of history, starting at the Protestant revolts, going through the Enlightenment, Bolshevism, and all the general tendencies of leftward revolutions that have engulfed the war and some of the problems that we've had. I hope you enjoy this interview. Thanks a lot, guys.
So I saw that you released another cast that popped up earlier. It looks like number 20 or something on Mussolini. Were there any kind of new insights or any thoughts you had in regards to how Italy might be kind of a mirror of what we're seeing unfolding in America right now, of the Italy of the past?
Yeah, it was I did a thing. I saw a documentary by the BBC on the current state of Italian fascism over there and how it relates back to history and many Italians not letting go of history, especially fascism, and how fascism is still a big thing in Italy over there. And I did a reaction video responding to the video, which came with a heavy progressive bias on the Italian people and the current state of affairs over there, which is fascinating to have the British critique the Italians, considering right now the British are having their own problems over there as they're being swarmed with what do you call weaponized migration right now. I think the British got their own problems rather than focus on and worry about what the Italians are dealing with. That's the funny thing about it.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. They do have a lot of their own problems that they need to deal with. And I just, I have that you sent that to me, and I watched the majority of that, if not all of it. I may have watched the whole thing. And I don't believe that not once, when referring to any of the history that unfolded there in Italy, did they ever actually call the group that the fascists were fighting communists. They never used that word once, did they?
No, not once. They're always called partisans or anti-fascists. They never use the word communism there. That's what's interesting about it, and that really is what that battle is really always been about since going all the way back to Mussolini, and the documentary itself was clearly a left-wing bias, and you hear a lot of the liberal tropes about today's society using the liberal values of our society today in order to pigeonhole Italians as kind of being backward ass and not letting go of history. And how could you, support criminals, historical criminals, things of that nature, which of course, there's a lot more nuance there, but it's also a dishonest assessment in order to make sure that there isn't any challenges to the liberal order at this point, because that's really the only thing that really challenges the liberal order now is the far right movements in Italy. Now, whether that's an integralist movement or a fascist movement or Pelagianism, like in Spain, things of that nature, those are the groups that really present a problem. Like in America, we have the conservative right. They're really not a challenge to the left. They never have been. That's why America has always been going to the far left since the founding for the most part. And that is because, again, both the left and the right in America are based off Enlightenment principles. And in one capacity or another, they eventually meet on basic tenets of political philosophy. And the right has always failed to challenge the left and their progressive power grab, especially over the last century.
So, since we're here, what do you think about like some of the revolutions of the past, whether we're talking about the liberal revolutions, like the French Revolution, or we're talking about more modern revolutions, late 19th into the 20th century when it comes to communism? What do you think there in terms of like what did we see in the past that we might be kind of seeing right now? Any kind of connections to those things there where we might have some insight into what we could see here in the United States or over in Europe?
what I can say is that we've been in a perpetual state of revolution since the Protestant revolts, right? And it takes a vast political leftist turn at the Enlightenment. And if you
Let me
move on
just-
from the Franklin.
Let me stop you right there. I don't want to interrupt your flow, but just briefly, like when you say the
Mhm.
Protestant Reformation, I think what you're referencing to there when you're talking about a perpetual state of revolution is that the West traditionally, before 500 years ago, was Catholic for 1500 years.
Yeah.
That's kind of a big deal, right?
Yeah, it was. And you know, the interesting thing about it is that um it's framed in a religious light, right? With Martin Luther, you know, planting his 90-something thesis on Wittenberg door over there, and people rebelling against a corrupt Catholic Church and things of that nature. But when you, in fact, you study the Protestant revolt, it was a political revolution more than anything else. The princes of the North had run their treasuries dry, and the revolt was supported by Luther, who needed a face, for a theological face, to deal with a society and a culture much more religious. But really, the end goal was for the princes to rob all the church property from the church itself, in order to again fill its coffers, or deal with its debt issue at the time. But Luther gave it a religious face to give it more legitimacy. And it goes back to what I've heard recently, something I've been studying recently, is that all wars effectively are fought over resources, right? Whatever face we're given by governments, whether it's you know, an inquisition or weapons of mass destruction, or you know, whatever it may be, that's usually for the people to be sold on a war, right? To try and invigorate a fervor in a nation to support the wars of government, right? Everybody is Hitler in modern times now. And as long as somebody's Hitler, everybody's ready to go to war. But in fact, it's really the power brokers behind the scene. Luther was the face of the Protestant revolt, but behind the scenes, it was the princes that were maneuvering with resources that were needed at the time.
And so basically, it was just convenient for those princes to let the Protestant revolt occur within their kingdoms in order to confiscate church land. Is that essentially what it boils down to?
Yeah,
I mean, was
yeah,
the church
pretty much.
like, was the church somehow like starving people out or something, or did they
Yeah,
have debts that
I you know, yeah, I mean, there was issues that were going on there. I think clearly you saw that in Scandinavia, you saw that in England. They went straight after the properties of the church. They persecuted the Catholics there. And it was a big byproduct of the Protestant revolts. Again, you use theology to distract people and to try and create a new moral order in order to justify it at the end of the day. So we haggle over sola fide, we haggle over sola scriptura, when we know those theological principles are preposterous. But in fact, nobody believed in those things for the first 1,500 years of Christendom. And to this day, we kind of use those as a cover to continue to argue with one another. And this is why, you know, when it comes to Christian apologetics, I just, it's frustrating to me, because I sense that it's mostly sophistry at this point, especially when, you know, we've had now 500 years of apologetics, and Protestantism has been proven wrong in every capacity. That's not to say the Catholic Church doesn't have its problems, but they're problems of a different nature, right? That Protestantism is a sophistry movement that actually mocks Christianity at this point in history, especially with all of its divisions and all of its different strange and odd flavors, especially in America.
So I think that the point is that the West was built up on Catholicism for 1,500 years. Yes, there was arguments early on between Gnostics and Catholic bishops and that kind of stuff, but overall, the West was Catholic. There's also, you know, the Arian stuff that was brief, and oddly enough, it looked like Catholicism should have been stomped out. But I mean, again, miracles. But so for 1,500 years, we have this tradition, and like, even if you don't believe in it, right, Frank? Even if you don't believe in what the Catholic Church teaches, you can't ignore the historical and the sociological problems that come along with suddenly overturning an entire continent's structure, the way it operated for 1,500 years. So like, the popes themselves were responsible for stopping a lot of wars that would have broken out over those 1,500 years, right?
Yeah, the way I heard it best described very recently, I believe it was Hilaire Belloc that said this. I've been studying Hilaire Belloc lately, going through some stuff in the relationship between him and Mussolini. I'm going to be doing a cast on that. But Hilaire Belloc said that Europe, that the church was Europe and Europe was the church, right? The moment the Catholic faith is undercut from Europe, Europe fundamentally changes. And this is what really is in essence, the lead up to all the revolutions that you start talking about. The moment the hegemony of the faith is undercut in Europe, you begin to see all these fractures and all these divisions and all these wars. You know, a lot of classical liberals say, well, we needed the Enlightenment and we needed sort of liberal governments in order to stop all the religious wars, as they said. Well, the religious wars were the byproduct of the Protestant revolt, dividing the cultural and the religious hegemony of Europe. And so that eventually, of course, will lead to the political divisions, right? Because the moment you remove the church as the moral arbiter of truth, the governments and the monarchs, they're next, because the monarchs always got their legitimacy in many respects from the church. And so it was sort of a symbiotic relationship that the monarchs and the church had. And the moment you undermine the faith, you undermine the legitimacy of the monarchical governments. And then here come all the grand revolutions and all the ideas of liberals that vary in degree. And everybody now, under the guise of individual rights and liberal parliamentary governments, now start concocting one thesis after another. And this is what we see. I mean, there's a reason why, you know, we get to the 20th century and we end on two major world wars, the two greatest wars in history on that European continent that effectively abandoned the Catholic faith. And you know, we go from an American Revolution to a French Revolution to, you know, again, one revolution after another, all throughout the 1800s and 1900s, culminating in these two great world wars, and eventually a Cold War, ironically enough. You know, again, these kinds of wars, the all-out war theory, the magnitude of war over the past 200 years, yeah, I get it. Technology plays a factor, but these kind of events didn't happen on a global scale like this under Catholic influence, where the church and Europe were united as one.
I think we underestimate the sophistication of the propaganda campaign that was waged as well, not just in the realm of theology against the church, but also the philosophical realm in terms of the Enlightenment. I mean, it was very clear that certain Enlightenment thinkers wanted to absolutely bury the church with their, really what I would consider, propaganda. And they didn't accomplish that, but they certainly created a lot of chaos, because bad philosophy leads to the types of revolutions that we've seen. You know, I think that's what a lot of people have failed to see, that the Enlightenment itself is a big issue when it comes to this, because there's not just an undermining of the church and the state, but ultimately those states are connected to familial structures that have gone back into ancient times prior to, in some cases, prior to the church being there, right? And
Yeah,
you know, that and eventually the family is undermined, correct? The family itself.
yeah. I mean, what's, you know, again, what's been the attack in the past century? It's called the cultural Marxists, again, a byproduct of that Enlightenment revolution, has attacked the family for the past century, right? Historian Charles Colon has said it the best. It's been an attack on altar, throne, and family. The Protestant revolt was the attack on the altar. The Enlightenment was attack on the monarchies, and of course, the cultural Marxists attacked the family for the past century. And we've seen everything kind of go, excuse my language, batshit crazy all over the world, especially in the West. It's unrecognizable anymore. You know, it's funny, Anthony, because a lot of people will point out to the struggles within the Catholic Church today, right? And they see a thing. Well, okay, see, the Catholic Church is like any other institution, therefore we got to give up on it and find another answer. And it's funny because I see a sort of a correlation between sort of the church's loss in its own mission in many ways and the collapse of the West, because Europe was Catholic and the church was Europe in many respects. The West can't survive without the Catholic Church, without a healthy Catholic Church. Now, how do we get back there, right? And we can have discussions on that. But it's not a sign of, okay, the Catholic Church has fallen, let's move on. It's like any other church. It's actually the opposite. It shows how without the moral law of the Catholic Church, not the Protestants and their subjective theology, their subjective interpretation of Scripture, that is garbage. I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but from saying that, Europe's strength was when it was Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, historically, that just pans out. I mean, what did France have? Something like 900 years of stability?
Yeah, it was a glorious empire from my understanding. I haven't studied the French monarchy as closely as in more modern times and what has happened since the Enlightenment. And so I probably won't be the best guy to ask on that. But generally, from my understanding, we had great saints that led France. As White, she was always referred to as the eldest daughter of the church. I mean, you just got to ask yourself, how many saints do we have, or how many monarchs do we have as saints? And how many modern presidents of the liberal republics do we have as saints? It's all how you got to look at this thing. I think we have Garcia Moreno, who's a devout Catholic in Ecuador, right around the 17th, 18th century. He was a saint. And that's pretty much it, because all these liberalism leads to lots of nefarious contradictions within culture, society, religion. You know, the monarchs, many of them were saints. And democracy tends to elevate the biggest narcissists.
Yeah, I believe it was, it wasn't FDR, it was Teddy Roosevelt, I believe. It was visiting the king of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? And he kind of took a swipe at the king and asked him what emperors do these days, or something like that. He responded, "We protect our people from politicians."
Yeah, that's a funny one, without a doubt. You know, it's one of those things. Again, it was the politicians that led us to all these grand revolutions and these two world wars. It wasn't the kings.
Well,
And that was because
yeah, I think the key there is our people, right? Like there was a sense of people, like the leaders really thought about their people. It wasn't about how can I help this corporation. It wasn't about how can I get into this country and take it over and take their resources. It was more about like, how can we have a stable country?
yeah, exactly. Well, I think too, the issue is that with a monarch, you know, people tend to portray it as some sort of dictatorial, authoritarian rule with no limits on power, when it's actually the opposite. Because a monarch is the true face of the nation. And if a nation struggles, or its people are hungry, its people are upset, you know exactly where to go, right? What is the old saying? How do you get rid of a bad king? All it takes is one drop of poison. Where in the liberal republics of the West, since the Enlightenment, you got a situation where the representative government is actually a facade. It's a face. You don't really know who the bad guys are because they're behind closed doors. And you never know who to really go after at the end of the day. And listen, I'm not even a proclaimed monarchist per se. The point here is that even when you want to reform this kind of a system that has gone wayward, like all of the Western Republic have since the end of, you know, since the Enlightenment, nobody knows even where to start. Who do you take out first, right? Because again, the representatives that are elected, they're just puppet figures.
Okay, so let's bring this forward. So we have the French Revolution. Prior to that kicking off, you have a lot of pornography among the elite there. You have prostitution. You have wedlock falling apart. You have many orphans on the street. We see the same thing happen prior to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, moving into the 20th century. And so generally you see moral degradation and moral breakdown just repeatedly over and over and over again. And I think that makes a good case that, like, hey, maybe those 1500 years of Catholicism, maybe there was something going on that was correct there. And we could talk about France briefly, maybe, and it's such a Catholic nation. Like, why did it experience that? Right? What was going on there?
Yeah, France. In France, I think it was being overrun by lots of nefarious ideologies. I know I was reading a book, I forgot the name of the author, about the role of Freemasonry in France in the lead up to the French Revolution itself. And one of the things that was very prevalent in France was Kabbalah and the effects that Kabbalah had on the population, especially within the realm of the Masonic lodges. And so you got to ask yourself, what is Kabbalah? How does it have an effect? From my basic understanding, it's not good. Let's put it that way, in the spiritual realm. And so this is why many people say that by the time you get to the French Revolution and the madness, right? The madness of putting people to the guillotine because a lady was walking down the street and she had a nice dress, and all of a sudden, because she had a nice dress, you put her to the guillotine and put her to death. That's demonic influence. There's no doubt about that, right? How you could take, the Sisters of Compiègne, I believe it's pronounced, the 16 nuns, who they took up to the guillotine and beheaded all 16 of them. How you see, a bunch of women, ladies devoted to God, doing the duties of God, of charity, things of that nature, that you have to put them to death. Something went terribly wrong of a deep, dark spiritual nature in France, and I think that is really at the core of it more than its politics.
Yeah, I think when you're hitting on Freemasonry and secret societies, that's probably really what we need to pay attention to, because behind the scenes, they've been the ones undermining the previous structures of power so that they could come into power. I mean, power, there is a reason why they call it the New World Order, right? And even some of the more, I think, naive Freemasons, like I'm thinking specifically of John Adams, because he started to warn other Masons in America that the Illuminati had infiltrated the Masons.
Yeah.
I think he just didn't understand how many layers there were to this thing, right? And so, like, I'm sure there were many associated with the Illuminati that were in the Freemasons, because the Freemasons weren't started by the Freemasons. It goes back to these other secret societies that potentially started them up. But one thing the Freemasons talk about is that the direct fight against the church, like, creating martyrs, was not the way to go. They specifically talked about how they needed to spread and take over through corruption of the heart and soul. And so what better way to do that than with messing with the sexual drive, right? Probably the easiest thing to take advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's part of the issue. I think it's a matter of the heart at the end of the day, and again, consolidating faith, and also too, I mean, oh boy, I don't know how far down this rabbit hole you want to go, but there was non-Catholics that were all up and down and around within the realm of these revolutions, looking to upset the Catholic social order at the time. And so that's what we have to remember. First, it starts with Protestants. There's always disputes with the Jews, of course, historically as well too. what role did they play in order to disrupt the social order in these Catholic kingdoms? Both groups were very revolutionary in that sense, and so you do have a clash of civilizations, you have a clash of cultures, of principles and ideas. Like you said, pornography was at the mix of this, and the best way to destroy the natural order of society is to go after the family, destroy the family, you destroy the political system, you destroy the natural order of civilization, and you're left with the soul of society.
Right, so we see the same thing in the Bolshevik Revolution, exact same thing, and it just so happens, as you bring up, we see elements of Kabbalah and Freemasonry. We see later on that the communists were the Bolshevik Jews, right? The one party there in Russia, anyway. And I've listened to stuff on that. Some people have said, well, it really wasn't that many. Other people have said that no, actually it was, and that's why they were called that. And so it's very interesting how I think there's a disconnect in the West. Like, we don't understand historically who we were or where we came from. And since we can't understand who we were, we're not understanding the nature of the attack.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think that's exactly what has happened. That is, if you don't know who you are, what your roots are, what your bloodline is, what your traditions, your history, your ancestral roots are, you get a quick case of amnesia, and you're left with a society that has an identity crisis, right? This is why the weaponized migration that we have coming from Africa and the Middle East into the West is purposely to designed to destroy the West, right? To purposely create a people with no history. And once there's no history and no identity, they're very easy to manipulate. They're very easy to control at the end of the day. This has been happening for a long time now. The key to it all was always destroying the Catholic Church and eventually destroying Catholic identity. The Catholics were always the biggest pain in the ass to the liberal world order, precisely because we're not conformists. See, Protestants are conformists. They have to be conformists in order to get along with each other, right? A general abstract theology with a general abstract moral law, but that doesn't work with Catholics, right? We have a definitive history through a 2,000-year analogy of the faith that goes all the way back to Jesus Christ, and it's unalterable. That analogy of the faith, and which goes into the morality of the system itself. And this is why, by the time we have 200 years of revolutions from the Enlightenment all the way really to the end of World War II, what is it? What is it in effect? World War I and World War II. They're Western liberal nations, Protestant Western liberal nations, and Bolsheviks that effectively team up to destroy the last of the Catholic nations. That's what you effectively have. The Catholic world had to be destroyed for the liberal order to kind of march forward and win this war.
Well, I think Woodrow Wilson's outlook on World War One illustrates that, right? He wasn't willing to end that war until the Austro-Hungarian Empire was basically wiped off the map, correct?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, he was a very notorious figure, without a doubt. I mean, listen, it starts at the Spanish-American War, right? With a red flag operation to blow up one of those ships to start that war in France, Cuba, with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, and it's America attacking a sovereign Catholic nation, is what it is. Only to again take resources and colonial lands and to shift hands, I guess you could say, shift authorities there, right? And when you look at that, the 1800s and the early 1900s, it's all about a race for resources all over the world. Part of it had to do with the Industrial Revolution. In order to survive, acquiring natural resources, steel, oil, metals, things of that nature. But a lot of it was also a moral message of sort of liberal fortitude to proclaim itself as a superior ideology than that of the old Catholic world. And that's why we see, uh, whether it's the British Empire or the French Empire, all the colonization, America partakes of that, right? Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii. And then when things become a little bit uncomfortable with colonialization, by the time we get to the mid 1900s, we start to change tactics and terms, right? We don't actually conquest nations and take them over. What we do is we spread freedom and liberty and democracy all over the world. And well, who can argue against freedom and liberty, right? In the meantime, we just simply allow our corporations to go into these countries and again create the same usury economic system we have here.
Yeah, yeah, good breakdown. How it moves into modern times. And I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah. So yeah, there you have it, my friend. You know, so